Okay, so welcome to our final session of the day. And in this session, we're focusing on hearing from academics, but also policymakers on the social value of community events. We've heard quite a lot about community today in the tourism context and the cultural context, and this is in the focus of the events context. And we're interested in the contribution that community events can make to individual and community well-being. We think that the importance of community events is only heightened really with the onset of the pandemic, and where people became much more dependent on each other, living in proximity to each other, etc. So in this panel, we're going to reflect on research conducted by the panel on the value of community events, and also consider how the pandemic has altered their role. So we've got three speakers with us here. First, we have Amy Finch, who's Head of Policy and Impact at Spirit of 2012. It's the social legacy funder from the London 2012 Games, and Spirit of 2012 advocates for the role of events as catalysts in contributing to happier people and happier places. We've also got Nancy Stephenson, who's Director of Write Retreat UK and also runs writing retreats and workshops for academics and researchers. And Nancy also lectures part-time at the University of Westminster. Most of her research focuses on community-led festivals and events. And finally, we have Gill Mcpherson, who you've already seen, who is the Chair in Events and Cultural Policy here at UWS and Director of the Centre for Culture, Sport and Events. So we've got two questions, and we're going to break those up into around about 5 minutes each. So I'm going to start with you, Amy. And the first question is, what effect did the coronavirus pandemic have on the role and social value of community events?
Hi, thank you so much for having me, David. And as David said, I work for a funder, Spirit of 2012, and we fund lots of different levels of events. So we've been a principal funder of big things like Cities of Culture, but also really feel that there's an importance to those small community events. And we're delighted to work with David, Gayle and the team on a piece of research exploring how you might measure social value in a proportionate way, which I know Gayle is going to speak a little bit more about. So in terms of the question and the effects on the pandemic, well, first of all, I think it showed us partly what we were missing, and that's underlined by the Jubilee weekend, where kind of a back to normal vibe saw more than 16.75 million people getting involved in community events across the country. So 1 in 4 people across the UK getting involved in community events a couple of weeks ago. And there's a real appetite to return to those activities. So I think that showed. That said, there were phenomenal community organisations that transferred their events online, and there were some real successes here too. So one of the aspects of social value that Gayle and team highlighted was identity formation and civic pride. And we saw some really great projects over the past couple of years that worked around restrictions to put on events that strengthened local identity. So whether that was digital events, whether that was taking art, physical activity, food, dance to people in the streets. So one example that we funded was a mixed religious community in Northern Ireland, which were able to increase the portion of residents who believed their area was a place where people got on through a kind of whole program of street level events that they did. A second thing that I think the pandemic really showed was a sharpened awareness of the barriers to access that people have. So some of the reasons why people couldn't attend community events. And I think that will have a long-lasting legacy. So we were funding a music-making project for carers at the time. It just launched in November 2019. And we saw originally, obviously, that was going to be lots of events in person. Actually, the way that the projects worked really hard to think about how did that translate to online spaces that still built a sense of community at the same time as giving carers the flexibility within their schedules to still look after their loved ones at the same time as running their events. I think that there's also an issue with a lot of the social power of events coming from things that happen outside the official boundaries of the event schedule. It's fantastic that today people from loads of different parts of the 4 nations can participate in this symposium, but the sorts of organic connection that you can make by attending events in person, whether that's at this kind of conference level or whether that's at a community level, don't translate as easily to digital. And I think although bonding capital was able to be really strong, I do think some of that bridging capital and organic connection making has been missed over the last couple of years. So I'll leave it there for now, and I can go into a couple more examples of those things later if we get a chance.
That's great, Amy. I think that context of bonding and bridging capital will be really relevant to many people in the audience. I'm sure Nancy may well touch on that too in terms of her own research. Nancy, would you like to take us away in your contribution?
Okay, so in answering the first question, I've thought partly about a paper that's in process at the moment, and that was about trying to organise an event for the community in lockdown 1 and the challenges around that. So I'm going to think about that a little bit and then perhaps go into thinking about the theory a bit more in answer to the second question. But I think for many of us in communities, the instruction to stay at home, meaning that we worked, schooled, did everything at home, really limited our interaction. Okay, we could meet other people online, but it was an incredibly stressful time with a lot of isolation and uncertainty. And also a time when everyone was adapting. There was this huge adaptation towards circumstances. So in many areas, some events went online, and Amy just mentioned those. And, there were some advantages to that. We could meet people from all over the world, but there's a limitation as well, partly that some people don't have the knowledge or the facilities at home to engage in online events. But within my area, there were online quizzes, book groups, things like that. And then there were the events in lockdown 1 that happened from doorsteps, like the clap. We really embraced the clap in our neighbourhood, and we decided weekly wasn't enough, nightly claps. And actually, it was just going outside to wave to neighbours. You clap, you wave to neighbours, you go back in. But it was a sort of check that people are all right. So then you've got these sort of hybrid, quite strange, small events. I was involved in organising a community green festival prior to the pandemic. And initially in lockdown 1, there was a complete, oh my gosh, we just can't do it. We had permission to close the street. We couldn't do all the things we wanted to do. And then we started to look at advice from the Eden Project, from the Cox Foundation, and look out at what was happening in other communities. And there were some real issues, within many communities. One, there were lots of new support organisations, so lots of informal volunteering within communities, looking out for neighbours, buying shopping for people. And so certainly in my experience, but in many other communities where I've spoken to people, basically we became more local, but we really became local. So prior to the pandemic, for me, my neighbourhood was about 15 streets of houses and 2 estates. In lockdown 1, my neighbourhood was my street. It was the people that I could see from the house. And I think also there was a fearfulness of other people if you live in urban areas. So our conceptualization of community changed, our conceptualization of place changed, of neighbourhood. Our local streets, parks became very crowded because everyone took their hour of exercise, and everyone that was allowed to. And so actually public spaces were really crowded. So within this context, it became much more important to work out how to connect and how to connect in an inclusive way. And we started to work from, not just advice from other places, but start to think about the fact, Brent talks about community events as bursts of community, and we felt like we needed a burst of community. We needed something to reaffirm who we were as a community in this difficult time. And so we reconceptualized the events away from, it was still called a Green Festival, but we moved away from environmental campaigning, all the things that we initially had thought about. We moved away from anything that might involve gathering, but still trying to think about face-to-face, some sort of face-to-face interaction where we could see one another. We tried to get lots of people involved with the idea that the more of us that were volunteering towards this, one, it would be good for our community, but there's lots of theory out there about community volunteering is very good for the individuals who do it as well because of our sense of self. So there were social aspects to our event practice in this stage. The event involved us reworking and rethinking our local environment. We had to adapt the event in terms of how can we get people moving through space, through particularly one street? How could we encourage them to move through space and not gather? How could we do a whole range of other things? And actually we came up with installations in front gardens, things that occurred over 2 weeks rather than one day, quizzes, things like that, that meant that people kept on going through this dressed street and had a sense of community. Being involved in this event gave us an opportunity as a street to collaborate with one another and to think really creatively, because there weren't any rules. There wasn't a sort of, this is how one does a community event, this is how it's happened in the past. Much more around, this is how we might be able to do something. Worrying about the boundaries between what happens if we put music on from front gardens, what happens if there's a gathering? Do we get fined? We had one case during the 2 weeks where the police did arrive, but we were in front gardens and they went away. But that thing between what can we do and what can't we do, and where are the boundaries? And if we go over the boundaries, are we breaking the law? Are we going to be fined? So, I mean, it's actually a really interesting process of negotiation between all of us. You know, someone saying, I'd like to do this. And I was saying, oh, how can we manage that so that we don't break the law? But most importantly, this was a really important opportunity for us to be lighthearted and frivolous. And I've written about this in the past. I've written about how important pleasure is in terms of community building. But actually, more than any time in the past, in lockdown 1, we needed to play, we needed to laugh, we needed just to do some stuff to let off steam. So you know, coming back to what effect did the pandemic have on the role and social value? The role and social value of community events within my own experience and within the other communities that I've looked at for the paper. This was almost the most important time ever in terms of creating a community event. It was something that we had to do because it was a time when, even if you run community events, the community was under such stress that you needed to have that place where we could talk, get together. In the end, a mix of things that was online and you know, and face to face. But we could just play. We could play. 2 weeks of play. That's it from me.
Thank you very much, Nancy. That idea of something that we had to do, I think, is really poignant in terms of just the need that people had for those kind of activities. Gayle, would you like to just take us in your point on the first question, please?
Yeah, thanks very much. Just following on from Amy and Nancy, they're absolutely right about the role and importance of events. So I was maybe just going to start off with a little bit about why events were important anyway in society before we get to the sort of pandemic. So, for example, looking at the role events play in communities is important. We've always said it's important to the social fabric of society. Events can affect communities by influencing people, how people view places where it's hosted, and positive event experiences can enhance a person's perception of and attachment to a place, as well as serving to better establish or to make that place within its locality. Place then effects include things like place attachment, pride in place making, place identity, which is more about the internal perspectives, and place image, which is more about the external perceptions or how people view it externally. And then place effects differ according to the pre-existing association that a person has with a given place. Thus, local residents' place-based perceptions will differ from visitors' views. An attachment to and pride in a locality can offer a shared identity to a diverse population, and it's part of that identity within the locality that we saw change during the pandemic. As Amy said, she commissioned CCE and other people that were in our consortium to conduct a study on behalf of Spirit of London and Local Trust, examining the social value of community events. And we conducted this during the pandemic, so it was quite tricky because many people had stopped the events that they were running and were having to think differently. So we sort of we were able to see firsthand the different experiences of those trying to run some kind of events and festivals during the pandemic within their local community. So as part of this, we developed an evidence review of the social value of community events, charting and discussing the idea of a moment of an event to creating a movement to change, or the other way around, as others have talked about as well, there is perhaps a movement to change within a local community that culminates in a celebration through an event. And that happened in different communities. In both of those ways, an event may have started a shift towards change and engagement with people, or the pandemic brought people together and thought about how they were going to create a change, and that culminated in a series of events. We identified 6 dimensions of social value from our evidence review: place, community, participation, well-being, learning and disruption. We then developed a series of indicators to measure and evaluate these, and these are widely available and we can share them with you. Some of the report is available on Spirit of 2012's website, but the indicators one is separate, I think. We examined how events, even during the pandemic, help local people tackle issues such as loneliness, well-being and inclusion. And Nancy referred to some of that, about how you brought people together in your street, and maybe people came out from the first time that hadn't been included or participated in events before. And these may have been really small scale. Some of the ones that were funded through Spirit were much larger scale and involved other groups as well within communities. Many events that took place stopped, but people thought differently and brought people together through online gatherings and many more outdoor events. Place and locality became important. Interaction and positive experiences from meeting through events became significant in tackling loneliness, increasing participation, even from people who hadn't participated previously. Governments and agencies are now looking at how well-being is being planned and integrated purposefully to help physical and mental health. And that's one of the key things that we saw coming out of the pandemic, is that this was becoming more important, and issues such as well-being were being highlighted at a governmental level. So to sum up, the social value of events did in fact become much more important to communities during the pandemic. Thanks.
Thank you, Gayle. Okay, that's really good. We set the scene for what we sort of see the impact perhaps of the pandemic on the role and value of community events. Nancy, I wonder if you could take us to the second question, which is around about what purpose do you think community events are going to play in what we might hope to be a post-pandemic environment, socially, culturally, or economically?
And I'll focus more on socially and culturally, because I haven't done any research on economically, because most of the events I look at are community instigated. Well, I think going forward, their role really is around connecting us to one another, facilitating encounters. There's lots of literature around the fact that that although even if we live in culturally very diverse areas, that we tend to our networks tend to be with people who are quite similar. So events can actually disrupt and start to break down some of our norms in terms of our normal social groups, and they can actually facilitate encounters across different groups. So going on, I think that's a really important role for them. Going on, I think they will continue to have that role in terms of connecting us to places, to making us feel that we belong or that we fit within places. going forward, they will also continue to be a way of expressing community value. And I think that, you know, when we think about events, we can't really think about them on their own. They're part and parcel. They happen with other events. Many people who are involved in putting together one event will be involved in a whole range of other political actions or a range of events. And these are a cumulative expression of community value. So like events are a way of being or doing community. They're one of the many ways in which people can be or do community. They can express their values. In my paper that I wrote in 2021, I also started to think about events as a practice of social sustainability. And I picked out, I spent a long while thinking about what social sustainability was, but I picked out 5 things that were identified by Dempsey, and they look at many different indicators, I think 20 non-physical, 8 physical, but I picked out social capital, social interaction, community participation, sense of place and well-being. And I talk to each of these in terms of what events do and might do going forward. And when we think of the range of activities that facilitate encounters, the conversations that happen during and after events, that whole thing about events, you know, if you say to someone, would you like to come to a council meeting to discuss social sustainability? You know, you'll get six activists, maybe, if you're very lucky. If you say, oh, let's get together and have a community party or a community do, and you identify lots of things that people want to come to, often you have those same conversations. You just don't have them within that remit of a sort of formal, how do we move things forward? You have them within that, we're playing around with some ideas. Hey, while we're doing this, why don't we, one of the things that we did was, why don't we put plants right the way across the street at one end and just keep traffic out for a couple of days and see if anyone stops us? What would happen? And that's now moving into a discussion about parklets. Can we create little parks? Can we shut off the street? So there are places where you can just start to be a little bit cheeky sometimes around those edges of what are we and what can we do? The reality is that, I'm not sure about your audience, but most of us live in societies where neoliberal values are up there and third wave values sit somewhere. And, you know, the effect of that is that the state is going to continue to do less and more will be pushed out to communities. And so as we move on, post-pandemic, if there is such a thing, or the next phase of the pandemic, as we move on, I think it's likely that the communities will be expected to take on more in terms of providing for other members of the communities. So there's something there as well. So as I've said, I think that moving forward, that this is a practice that will continue to be important and perhaps more important as we're moving through this difficult time, probably with more waves, and probably, you know, we're not through it yet and probably not for a while, but a way of thinking about social sustainability, a way of thinking about what community means to us, a way of thinking about place, a way of working out, do we want to invite people into our communities? Not all communities do. Some communities feel that they have quite enough tourists coming in anyway. So that whole thing about how do we want to be presenting ourselves to other people, or do we want to turn inwards a little bit and spend some time thinking about who we are and what that means? So just leaving us with that idea as community events are a practice of community. They're a way of being or doing community. And in a neoliberal context, they will become more and more important as time goes on.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Yeah, there's some fascinating insights there. The kind of decision to try and close a street or use mechanisms through which to close a street certainly seemed to be something that came through in the pandemic, where people began to realise that these were less regulated spaces and actually you could do so much with them. And then, you know, the potential straight return to sort of commercial streets, motorised streets is obviously something quite concerning, I think. So, Amy, would you like to add some thoughts to that second question too?
Yeah, great. I think that's a really interesting point that Nancy just made about turning inwards and the real value of spending that turning inwards time. But it's also, what do you lose from that? And one thing I'm going to be really interested in is the comparison between the whole City of Culture of 2017 and the Coventry City of Culture 2021, because I think that identity formation is also interaction with visitors to that place, and how kind of the interest in the place from outsiders interacts with your own community pride is something that's really, really intriguing. And Hull got a lot of visitors. Coventry inevitably got few, although they did have some chance to have some big showcase events. So. Okay, so for my section, I'm just going to give kind of three more positive trends, I think, coming out of the pandemic, two areas for concern and one kind of question. So in terms of the kind of positive changes to events, I think that focus on inclusion, who's not in the room or in the space, or how are you kind of missing people and why. Is really important. I'm hoping that the pandemic has accelerated people's to get rid of "they build it and they will come," "if you build it and they will come," and really started to get people thinking, well, why aren't they there, and how can we kind of offer things for everyone within a community. Second, I think that this trend to hyperlocal and bringing activities to people, to their streets, opening up what the spaces are that community events can happen in, is really, really exciting. And I think some of that will stay. Although that I do think that has that drawback as well. Is it a gateway to them engaging with lots of different activities within a wider space, or is it about the value of those events in and of themselves? And I think both of those things are really valuable. And secondly, this emphasis on health and well-being, which was already there, and Gayle mentioned that. But I think people having to look at how their event and how building social connections connect more to well-being is something that's been reinforced during the last couple of years. My couple of concerns are the one that I mentioned about bonding capital, and kind of looking at those opportunities for people to meet across divides. So I had a lovely quote I was going to share with you from a project we've funded in the Springburn area of Glasgow, of someone who's attended cricket events over the pre-pandemic, and he said he was a recent immigrant from Pakistan with 2 children, and he said, because Glasgow was new to us, we thought we were alone, but it has helped us to feel involved and achieve a different state of mind. And that, I think that's the power of what events can do. Nancy mentioned the Cox Foundation. It's their great get-together weekend this weekend. It's in partnership with they're one of the Refugee Week partners. And I think looking at that concept of welcome, looking at generational divides, is there a risk that when you're a park programmer, you're looking at, can I offer events for everyone, but they're separate events, versus how can I design those opportunities that will, for people from different backgrounds, different walks of life, to come together. And my other concern is around greater complexity. So it has now got really challenging to organise events, last minute cancellations. We've got spiralling costs of these things as well. People not being able to commit to things on time. And Nancy mentioned the creativity that can bring, but it also is a risk that people will need to retrench into doing the basics because of that increased complexity, and that will mitigate against some of those access benefits potentially. And my one unknown was about volunteering and how the different patterns of volunteering will interact with community events. So about 4 in 10 people in the country, according to our polling, have volunteered at an event. That's great. How does that interact with the kind of mutual aid groups and the local community volunteering that we've seen? And how does that interact with what we know of some groups that are slower to come back to volunteering. So we know that disabled people have not volunteered in the same numbers as pre-pandemic, not participating in physical activity at the same numbers, that kind of thing. So how is that going to bottom out over the coming months?
Thank you very much, Amy. Some really useful points there. I think we'll turn to these just in the summing up. Just going to hand to Gayle for the last contribution, Gayle, for this session. Then we'll open up. There's some questions already in the chat.
Thanks, David. Yeah, that's really interesting. It's sort of looking at, moving beyond the pandemic and environment and the socio-economic affair, cultural, and what role the events will play. And I think if we can frame that and what community events will play in terms of the role at a local level, a national level, and an international level, then I think one of you had said earlier about sometimes as an approach, you put them on and people will come, and it's about engagement and trying to get people to be involved, if that's locally. And then for local government and regional government, county level, there's also this drive to bring back tourism locally for the festivity and the events as well. And so if the local community believe in their community events and then they grow, it's like sowing the seed, or like the dandelion project just now. If we sow it, we grow it, we develop it, it can grow into this new partnerships, etc., and lead to other developments that then ties into our national level events agenda. And why shouldn't we celebrate what is good about them locally too? So in summing up, we have this sense of community that can be enhanced by events, and their outcomes clearly associated with the notions of social capital, like Amy was talking about, and networks and inclusion. It's taking that from the bonding to the bridging and moving beyond your own boundary to a regional and national level as well. The community effects emerge from the ways events strengthen existing social relationships and help to establish new ones. Community effects can occur at different levels. And in some of the theory that we looked at, we talked, and the practice, because bear in mind, we looked at 7 case studies throughout the UK here. And so we looked at how that actually works in practice and these different levels. So the emphasis on existing ties is significant for families and friendship groups, but establishing new bonds may allow community members to build relationships with people outside their day-to-day network. Events have a role to play in continuing to engage in wider community groups and increase the importance of locality, a sense of place and identity in touristic terms, and participation within the community, and helping to grow those social mobility networks, the social economy skills of volunteers and beyond. These can then be used to move from one-off events to working on a series of community interactions, to transformational practices of shared control over spaces and places and the running of groups and events. Maybe looking to the what Nancy was calling the social sustainability there, the shared control over engagement within the community and lead to an increased sense of purpose. And that sense of purpose is what we go back to, of seeing that ties in at a local, national, international level to the tourism and event strategies and the community wellbeing approach that will come to the fore. I think we'll see much more now. And certainly working with the Cox Foundation and others, we developed a template for evaluating the social value of community events. And I know there's a question on that. And so, yeah, we had good examples from that I'm sure Amy can talk about. Thanks.
Thank you, Gayle. So 3 excellent contributions. There are some really interesting questions from Harmon in the chat from DCMS around about, I guess, valuing, measuring, understanding some of these more social impacts that have been discussed here. There's sort of 3 questions. So maybe to sum up, it's really about how we might use potentially economic methodologies to value social impacts, or to understand value for money for impacts that are quite that are social in the wider context. How would we respond to that? Is it important to do this because funders might say, well, I'm interested in supporting community events for these well-being benefits, etc., but I need an understanding of measurements. So would anyone like to give us an initial response to those questions?
I can start, although I'm not. I'm not an academic, so I think Gayle and Nancy might have more to say on this. But from the funder point of view, what I would say is actually I don't always think that funders are interested in us those questions. Maybe that they could. That sometimes we're missing a trick on some evaluation that would work. So I mentioned nearly 17 million people taking part in Jubilee events. We didn't. I think there was an opportunity for funders to collaborate better on some simple evaluation methodologies that would have helped to get some consistent data across that. And then on the scale of some of the events that we're talking about, really doing one or two things more to improve your evaluation practice is what we're looking for. Some of these organisations are extremely low capacity, and doing even sort of pre-post evaluation things like that is a stretch, and they're collecting a lot of data where some are collecting a lot of data that isn't really telling them very much, so putting a lot of effort in and not getting much out in return, and these are volunteer-led organisations in a lot of cases. So I think the work that Gayle and David have done with others to think about proportionate evaluation for those organisations is really important. That said, we as funders and the government through its events programme is putting a lot of money into this, and so value for money things are important. We're going to be releasing a paper from IPPR in August looking at some of the more economic a lit review of the economic value of events that they're putting together for us at the moment. So it is an important question, but you have to decide where it's appropriate and at what level, because otherwise you're just actually reducing the value, the economic value, by wasting a lot of time.
Thank you very much, Amy. Nancy or Gayle, do either of you have a response to that sort of impact question?
Yeah, I mean, happy to talk through this even later with Harman. That's what I was saying. I think it's important not to replicate the economic tools that already exist out there. And one of the things that we were trying to do for the Project in Spirit was to look at, how, things like value for money we touched on, but not, it wasn't, we didn't develop key indicators for that in terms of the social value approach, because it wasn't the right thing. We were trying to emphasize how you would look at this differently and how you determine what success is. And so how you then use evaluative tools to determine the success and the impact that that's had in communities, whether that's in people's lives, whether it's in development of new networks, data that politicians and councillors are able to use to justify the resources that have been put, because we absolutely have to justify that. And I think it takes it to that level where when the event becomes big enough, you will work in parallel with the economic indicators as well. And it doesn't mean that you're not looking at them, but this was an emphasis more on, is there something more qualitatively where we can capture what the identity meant from this event to local people, how we tackled loneliness and how people were able to engage and participate in some of the data that we don't often have. We talk about, numbers through a door of an event, but you haven't talked about the journey they took to get there in the first place. And so the toolkit that we developed allows for you to set the parameters within that evaluation, and you can dip in and out of what you need. And I think Amy posted online the link to the different parts of the toolkit there, but we also have a bit more detailed links on the 6 elements of the social value that we can share with people as well. So, and then one of our PhD students in CCSE, Nicholas, myself, and Nicholas' PhD is specifically looking at how you analyse value for money and whether or not there's a willingness to pay from events locally, and the public value of events and how they are used to make change. So I think he's just got a book chapter coming out in that out of the FEST-based project, so a bit of a plug for that there for David and Andrew Smith and Bernadette Quinn for their book on that is due to come out, and that looks at some of the evidence of how you judge public value and then attribute that to value for money on an event that sometimes is free and what people would be willing to pay. But in many areas, for events that are already free, that's quite a difficult and tricky territory to navigate. But yeah, hopefully that helps.
Nancy, do you have a little comment on
Yeah,
that? And then I'll ask one more question after that.
Small, and that's really that. I think that we can see that the toolkits, the way we evaluate events, are becoming more and more sophisticated. And I guess one of the things that we need to continue to do as academics is to ask those questions about the aspects of events which might be problematic. So if we think about social capital, the extent to which, even if we're creating bridging capital, what tends to happen in the events that I've looked at is that people that have and people that put more in get more out. And so how do we deal with some of the inequalities that sit there underneath all of this? And I don't think there's necessarily an answer, but I think more and more we're beginning to think about those things. But sort of inequalities underpin all of this. And so if we're really thinking about things like social sustainability, we need to keep going back to that sort of the politics of how we evaluate events, the politics of how we collect data. That's our role as academics. So, and I think, we're embracing that, but we need to continue to do it.
Brilliant. I've got one more question. We've got other questions, but we'll try and find a way to get those answered at the end. The question is about, have you got any insights for during and post-pandemic for potentially building in resilience and flexibility in community events? So is there any evidence that that's happening, about how you build that into the situation around about community events? Maybe that's one for you, Amy, based on the work that Spirit does.
I think that's why I said my worry is this increasing complexity is a burden that perhaps isn't being fully funded, because it does, I think, cost more to build in this resilience, to kind of be operating on different tracks with your event planning, and it's certainly something that we've been keen to fund fully within our events, kind of looking at what are these additional access costs that are being put in, and how can you build in that time and pre-planning. But a lot of event organisers are operating on really tight timescales, and there just isn't that much space to build in that resilience and flexibility. So it's all down to the kind of talent, creativity, and inexhaustibility of some of these people that are actually putting on the events, from what I've seen. So I can praise some great practice, but not give very good answers.
That's no problem, Amy. We've obviously got some other questions, but we will get people to maybe get those to use all, and we can provide responses to people afterwards. I'm aware of time. It's been an afternoon of really enjoyable events, but we did say we'd be finished by 4 p.m. So I'm going to just draw the event to a close now. I want to thank, first of all, the speakers in this session for that really interesting discussion about community events and their value.